this chap who was a betting shop manager, who wasn't engineering orientated. He said, what do you do? So I said, I run rocket engines. So he said, where do you run them? I said, Anstey. He said, do you know, I've never ever seen a rocket go off from Anstey. He thought we launched them from there. You know.
Good job. Yes, we haven't seen them go either.
Hauptstufe gegeben. Stecker gefallen.
The Blitz brought hordes of German rockets showering down on the streets of London, heralding a new kind of warfare. Rockets could now be used to attack countries thousands of miles away, and following the test of Britain's first nuclear weapon, work began in earnest on a British rocket capable of carrying such deadly payloads across continents. Mixed results led to Britain abandoning its nuclear program and buying Polaris rockets from the Americans. But this was not the end of the story. The government had seen the potential of a small research rocket developed as part of the program. They believed this rocket could be adapted to launch satellites. And across the country, work started on Britain's first satellite launcher, Black Arrow.
You haven't rubbed it off, have you, eh?
That's it. That's my handwriting there. That there is my handwriting, so I can honestly say I did work on this engine. That's proof positive of me working on the engine. The skirt would come from AV Road. Then we would put all the chambers, pumps, gearboxes, valves into it. And that's when Fred would come in, and the technician, wouldn't you? If anything wasn't going right, Fred used to go and tweak it and one thing or other.
I had to try and find all the pipes that Ray had forgotten to tighten up.
No. Didn't happen, Freddie, didn't happen. You're exaggerating.
Yeah. The management, actually, on the rocket was very good, which is surprising because it was British management. They're usually rubbish. But the management said, look, these fitter guys, they spend all their lives putting these engines together. They can hear them run over the far side of the site, but they never get to see it. So we went through a phase when we used to invite a couple of fitters over to actually be in the test cell as we ran the engine. And that was good because, you know, it gave them a lot more interest. And I mean, they always built it as well as they could, with a good crowd of blokes, didn't they?
Yeah. We know how each other worked. We know what to watch with each other. Arthur would always tighten his bolt up and say, I'll finish before you did yours. There was a bit of joking like that, but yes, we were all very, very thoughtful. We all knew what we were doing, yeah. And in the rocket area, we were on the shop floor working in the rocket area, but we got a rate of pay equal to anybody else anywhere who were on piecework and everything else. So we didn't have to rush, we got it right. And we usually got it right first time, which I'm always very, very proud of, yeah.
We've even got a photograph of him doing that, so he's a piece of history as well, this chap is.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
There are slight differences on the photograph. But that's all.
There's me anyway, the young version. If I knew then what I know now, what would I have done? I don't know.
It was freezing cold up here most of the time. The winds, they were so strong they could throw pebbles up off the cliff face. But we were issued with duffel coats, and instead of hard hats in those days, it was woolly hats. looked a bit silly actually. But later on, during the days of Black Arrow, we all had to wear hard hats then, so it looked a bit more professional. But, you know, we were on a shoestring. We had to make do and mend with lots of things down here. Bristol Siddeley Anstey initially designed the engines. Then the motor bay was sent to our East Coast factory, where it was assembled to the rocket. And then the rocket and the engines were then brought up here and for eventually going through a static firing. We used to come up here with a low loader, pull up here underneath a big canopy, and then the rocket was hauled out of its crate on special gear and put on special trolleys and then moved through into here. And the doors shut, so it was out of the wind and the rain. And that was it. It would stay here for some weeks while the preparation checks were done, and then it would be put onto a low loader and taken down there towards the gantries. There are two gantries, or there were two gantries. One of the gantry positions is that remote concrete emplacement up there, and there's another one down here. The idea was that we would have one rocket in preparation and another rocket undergoing tests. Only at one time the program was going to require us to do a firing sort of once a month, but it never worked out quite like that. It had to be cut back.
The gantry, into which the rocket will now be loaded, surrounds the launcher and provides protection from the weather for the rocket itself and for the men working on it.
This is where the gantry stood. If you get up through there, 40 feet up. If you look over there, you can see the pads on which the gantry stood. And when it fired, it deflected out in that channel and out to sea. So, I mean, all this was where the action took place. And there was a steel ball, and that held the rocket down and stopped it flying up. And the only command that was necessary to set the rocket in motion was to say, "Let go," and up she went. But that only took place in Australia.
Yeah.
So that was a very important little piece of equipment, because if that failed, it would have gone up through the roof of the gantry. God knows what would have happened. I used to think, God, is it going to break? If it had done so, there would have been absolute mayhem, because it could have landed anywhere. And it could have flown off and landed in France or up country on Portsmouth, or maybe even as far as London. Down below here, there's a big platform where the HTP was handled. That's where the tank, the dispenser tank was placed, and where the guys actually filled the rocket with kerosene and HTP.
HTP is the oxidant used by the motors of Black Knight. It is high test peroxide. That is, hydrogen peroxide of a concentration greater than 80%. Although HTP is, without doubt, the most pleasant of all the oxidants to handle, precautions still have to be taken.
It's the same hydrogen peroxide that the ladies use to bleach the hair. But whereas the ladies are using hydrogen peroxide at about 2 or 3% concentration, the stuff we use is 86%. We had a chap called Tony Simpson. One day he went over to the test cell and it had a leak on the engine and he didn't realise, so he got some of this on his jacket. And when he went home that night and he was sat having his tea, his jacket burst into flames. So he tried to get the company to pay him back the money on his jacket. They wouldn't do it.
Not likely, no.
He said he should have been wearing the full-length plastic suit.
This HTP is very corrosive, and the men have to be fully protected with special clothing. Not everyone's idea of comfort,
It was like a boiler suit, only it was in PVC.
White PVC,
And
yeah.
then you had Wellingtons on, and the boiler suit wouldn't be, this suit went over your Wellingtons. And you'd a hood, and you'd goggles.
Because if spilled, it will set fire to ordinary clothing or anything else that will burn. If you doubt it, just watch this bush.
Although the engines were built in the Midlands and the completed rocket launched in Australia, the centre of Britain's rocket industry was the Isle of Wight, where the rockets were assembled and tested. Secret bunkers were built on the site of an old Napoleonic fort overlooking the Needles. It was here that the rocket engineers gathered the data they needed to be sure their rockets would fly.
So there was about, probably a dozen people altogether, plus one or two people wandering up and down looking rather anxious, people in overall command. I was one of them, but also the boss of the site was in there. And down below you can see the sort of instrumentation we had, which was basically 1950s technology. And instead of having these vast displays you see in the Cape Canaveral scenario, where you've got all these television screens and electronic clocks flashing away, we had a little mechanical clock, and that would count down from 2 minutes to the firing. So tick, 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 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and off we go. It was all programmed by pieces of cable. So you plugged a cable in there and the one there. So it was laced with cable. Not a computer. It wasn't a computer, was it?
The only evidence we have of it.
Ah, you've got one there. Yes. There you
There we
go.
are.
There you are. It was a thing like that. And these were all connectors, plugs and sockets. None of this business about changing the software or computerised.
Yeah.
It was all done like that. And it worked. And it worked perfectly too.
The last 2 minutes of the firing sequence are under entirely automatic control. And on this board, electrical circuits are set up which bring in all the various systems at the right time. And after these have been set and checked, the unit is securely locked. The red flag is hoisted, the site is in an active state, and the static firing is about to take place.
By that time, the dams would have been cleared, the red flag would have been flying, the Coast Guards and people would have been notified that a firing was imminent, and all the guys responsible for their individual systems would be sat at these consoles there, and the data recording guys in there nursing their bits of kit into operation. The secrets officer down in the blockhouse was the man who had the final arming pin, if you like, the plug to push in. And when the guys had finished fueling the vehicle, they would go into the blockhouse, pull the blast doors to behind them, still in their HTP suits, and hoping that there was not going to be any severe problem. The safety officer could see through the armoured glass, whichever country was being operated. And then, of course, when everything was at the last point, the safety officer would put in the arming plug, the auto sequencer would take over, and you'd
Stand back.
sit biting your nails, hoping that everything was going to go perfectly well through the next 30 seconds.
Is nearly over, and the safety officer is watching to see that the motors shut down cleanly. That is the end of a successful test, and the rocket will now be packed and dispatched to Australia.
Following rigorous testing, the first Black Arrow began the long journey to its launch site at Woomera in Australia.
300 miles northwest of Adelaide, just to the north of a dry salt pan called Lake Hart, is Woomera Range. Less than 20 years ago, it was no more than an isolated halt on the Trans-Australian Railway. Today, it's a busy little town in the middle of nowhere, with a population of well over 5,000, including 1,600 children.
So given that the weather is quite abysmal today, I know that most of you went out to Woomera. Could you tell us about it as a place? What was it like?
Flat, empty and no rain.
Well, I mean, basically, what happened was this village called Woomera was built out in the middle of the Australian desert. When I went out there, there were about 5,000 people working out there. All families in wooden chalets. I mean, you could walk to the perimeter of the road of the place, and from there, as far as the eye could see, for hundreds and hundreds of miles, there was nothing but Donga, which was stony desert, basically.
I remember there was one incident, I'm not sure whether it was a black arrow or a black knight, but we went to release it in Woomera, and it went up 5/8 of an inch, according to Jack Redpath, and then settled back.
And if it had gone past the top dead centre, it would have all gone over.
I have a text from this.
That's why we
manager
define a successful launch as 22 inches.
I had this telex from Jack Redpath, and it said, "Ray, congratulations are now due that we've explored space from 5/8 of an inch to 60 miles."
The first Black Arrow was launched from the Woomera Range on the 28th of June 1969. It carried no satellite and was designed to test the first stages of the rocket. But sadly, it never made it into space.
It was very apparent straight away that one pair of chambers was just rotating all the time, completely out of control.
That's a fantastic picture. I haven't seen that.
You see all the exhausts. And what had happened was one pair of these engines was doing that when it shouldn't have been. So the vehicle, these others, as Cliff said, were trying to fight those two. And of course,
it was going off track.
Obviously going off track.
Yeah. Oh, look, it's falling to pieces.
There's the bits. Yeah, there she goes.
Bang. Gee whiz.
Yeah, that safety officer there.
Is this the one where the range safety officer was quoted as saying, "I always wanted to blow a missile up"? I wouldn't be surprised. Sounds right.
Wow. Oh, I've not seen that one before.
No, I hadn't seen that.
Could you see that, Cliff, like that, or?
I was on top of the instrumentation building. It was about 2 odd miles. Marvellous view. The safety officer announced that I think it was 10,000 feet, wasn't it? You'd have to press a button for the brake-up system to operate it. And they just gave us that warning, and the next thing we saw was this bloody great flash right across the horizon. Incredible. And we were standing there. Our jaws were dropped, obviously completely depressed. But of course we'd forgotten. And suddenly, about 10 seconds later, we got the whole shockwave, the blast wave hit us, you know. But it was a really alarming sight, but...
Not the news you were hoping to hear from the first.
Oh, crumbs, no. No, of course not.
Of course not.
No, of course not. Because you've got to remember that the contracts that we had were every 3 months, and you were paid behind in retrospect over the 3 months, and each of those 3 months the contract could have been cancelled. So it could have been a disaster.
Yeah, that's right.
With the Treasury watching their every move and the threat of cancellation hanging over them, the next 2 test launches had to go well if the project was to survive. Although the first of these was trouble-free, the second rocket failed to place the dummy satellite it carried into orbit. A leak in the fuel tank caused a loss in velocity, and the rocket crashed into the sea. This gave the Treasury the excuse they needed, and on the 29th of July 1971, the Minister for Aerospace, Frederick Caulfield, stood up in the House of Commons to announce the cancellation of Black Arrow. But the Black Arrow boys refused to be beaten.
I'd heard this about it being cancelled, but I'd heard it so many times before, and almost every 3 months. I didn't take any notice of it. It was my decision as far as the company was concerned, because the whole contract was my responsibility. And I said, we're going on till somebody actually in writing tells us to stop. And we hadn't had it in writing, so we went on.
In an act of defiance, and to prove to the world that Britain could launch a satellite, the Black Arrow boys launched Black Arrow R3 on the 28th of October 1971. The launch was a complete success, and the rocket placed the satellite Prospero into a perfect orbit. The engineers at Woomera partied long into the night, but back on the Isle of Wight, the team had to face up to the reality that the project was over, and the government's decision was final.
Oh yes, I think they were embarrassed that it worked.
Yeah, they were embarrassed that it worked, yes. Because it went into a perfect orbit. Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think the guys had a big party, the whole of the range people had a party, but the realism kicked in immediately afterwards.
We couldn't really do that. We were so depressed about the cancellation, weren't we?
I think it was a different...
We were overcome with it.
But I mean...
well, I think obviously it was a mixed reaction.
Yes. It was on a Monday morning board meeting after the Friday that the launch was done. And the boss said, well done, Ray, you and your team. And he said, you know what you've got to do today, don't you? And I said, no, I don't. What? Go and tell the people at High End that we can't find jobs for half of them. Well, how do you think that made me feel? I didn't feel any joy whatsoever. I mean, that was said just like I've said it to you. So that's what I had to do. And I got in my car and off I went. Left the board meeting. And as I said, I even got tackled by an old school friend. What was I doing sucking him? He'd been working for 15 years for the company. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why was he out of a job? And I just had to say, I'm sorry, because we haven't got any work for you. It's as simple as that.